Hello there everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and this is the beginning of my Mythos series. I've been interested in Greek and Norse mythos since high school. I've always found it interesting to learn about the culture of the day and find what the values of the people are. And after reading books on the subject, I'm going to give a layout of different stories of different cultures and their characters. I'm hoping to make this series shorter than the last series before, so as not to drag it all out, and I hope to add some new elements. Now first, let's define terms. A myth basically is a poetic story meant to describe an unexplainable phenomenon by a culture. Legends are mono-episodic, localistic stories which are written in a historized way so they are believable. Folk tales are fictitious ahistorical stories that are designed to teach a moral. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and I'm going to be talking to you about Greek mythology and how it compares with others. Greek culture was a very human-centric culture, and its mythology reflects that. Egyptian and Mesopotamian culture portrayed their gods as animals, some of them as hybrids with people. While the Greek gods were taken seriously, it were also considered fine to laugh at the tales of Zeus's adulterous ways and the infighting amongst the gods. All the gods took on human emotions. Demigods and gods could come from real places, like for example Hercules coming from Thebes. Greek myths, like all myths, seek to describe features in nature, like how the universe came into being and where lightning came from. This isn't to say all Greek stories were myths like that. Some, like the quest of the Golden Fleece, were just meant to tell a story of adventure. Unlike what we have come to expect from gods in the West, the Greek gods believed the universe created the gods and not the other way around. The heaven and earth had been formed and the Titans were born from them, with Cronus being made in charge of all until his son Zeus dethroned him, whom he had tried to stop from that happening, but it didn't happen. The Greeks took the belief that chaos reigned over an unbroken darkness, and chaos gave birth to night and Erebus, which describes the depthness of death. The universe was just all black and empty. Darkness and death gave birth to love, which created light and day, which created the earth. Earth and heaven gave birth to what had the first appearance of life, which were large humanoid monsters with great power. Cyclops and Titans also came into being. The monsters were imprisoned by heaven due to their ugliness, which Mother Earth felt rage over and got the Titan Cronus to wound heaven for that. Cronus would be betrayed by his son Zeus, as fate said that it would. A big war would happen and Zeus would defeat his father Cronus and punish men like Atlas for helping the enemy by making him bear the pillars which held the heaven and the earth. Zeus would fight off many who tried to unseat him, like the Typhoon and the giants. His enemies were to be banished to the Tartarus. There are many tales of how humans would be created after this. I choose to focus on the Prometheus and Epimetheus account. Humans would be created a little while after, when the earth was ready. Prometheus and Epimetheus in many accounts are said to be the creators of humans. Epitheus in his foolish ways made man weak and with not as much protection as their other animals. And Prometheus made mankind better by giving them an upright stature and gave them fire for protection. Prometheus was met with anger from the gods as he favored humans and had gods get the worst part of the animals for sacrifice. There were no women originally, as Zeus made one later on in the form of Pandora, whom was a punishment to men as they were distracted by her beauty. Pandora, along with women in general, were considered evil to men with an evil nature to them, i.e. their curiosity. Given the widespread popularity of Pandora's box, I feel I only have to summarize it. Basically, Pandora was given a box containing evil. She opened it, thus releasing evil in the world, only leaving hope with it. This is obviously supposed to mean that hope is the one thing that mankind has in the face of evil. Prometheus would be punished by Zeus, whom had him bound by rocks and forced to have vultures eat at him every day, and this torture was also done to extract information given to Prometheus by fate, whom have told of a man that would dethrone Zeus. Prometheus would not budge though, and eventually would be let out by Hercules. Prometheus was known as the outlaw who rebelled against injustice. Like Christianity, the Greeks had a flood account where, like Yahweh, Zeus was tired of mankind's wickedness and seek to drown them. Like Noah's account, people survived via a boat-like vessel, in this case a big wooden chest, and the survivors were Euclesion and Pyrrha, whom were Prometheus' son and his niece. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello there everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the Roman gods. The Titans were the children of the heaven and the earth, with Cronus in charge of the other Titans until he was eventually dethroned by his son Zeus. The 12 Olympians lived on Mount Olympus, which while it has its idea on the real Mount Olympus in Thessaly, it is also an otherworldly place. I'm going to give you the top 3 characters of it all: Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. Zeus was the mightiest god whom could defeat all the other gods, but yet was not all-powerful and all-wise, as he could be duped and opposed by them. He would be known for his many love affairs from which he had to try to hide from his wife Hera. These love affair stories were a result of his worship being spread amongst towns and people wanting to fuse gods, and having the wife of the earlier town god have sex with Zeus essentially fused the cultures. His wife Hera would always try to get back at the woman who slept with her husband. Zeus still demanded respect and to be listened to despite this. Poseidon was Zeus's bro. He was the ruler of the sea, whom gave the first horse to man, and would carry a 3-pronged spear named a Triton. Hades was the third brother among the Olympians, who drew from his share the underworld and the rule over the dead. He was known for wearing an invisibility helmet, being filthy rich, and for pretty much always staying in the underworld and not going to Olympus. Despite what you may think, he wasn't an evil god, but rather just a cold but fair type of god. And he wasn't the god of the dead, but he was the king of the dead. Persephone was his queen. The underworld was considered a shadowy realm where the good are rewarded and the wicked punished. Tartarus was considered the lower region of the underworld, where people passed as soon as they died, and was where the sons of earth were kept. Charon would carry souls in his boat to those who could pay for his service. The 3-headed monster Cerberus was the guard for the gates of the Hades. The 3 judges, Brahmametha, Isius, and Minos, would pass sentence and determine whether you would get torment or be sent to the Elysian fields, i.e. pretty much their version of heaven. The Greek gods were turned into Roman gods as well, and would be given Roman names as well. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades would be called Jupiter, Neptune, and Pluto. Greek literature and art transformed Rome and made it far more interested in poetry and music. Before the Greeks came in, their gods were not really that personified outside of looks. One popular change in character happened with Saturn. Originally he was the protector of the seed, but became Cronus and the father of Jupiter, aka Zeus. The great feast of the Saturnalia paid homage to him. They celebrated the golden age return of the earth, when peacetime and merriment were key. Presents would be exchanged and all. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello there everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the Greek gods of the earth. The immortal gods, for the most part, were quite often very unuseful to humans at the very best, and harmful to humans at the worst. Ares and Athena would create wars, and Hera would perform numerous acts of injustice whenever she was in a jealous rage. Demeter and Dionysus were considered mankind's best friends, with Demeter being the goddess of the corn, and Dionysus the god of the vine. These tasks were given to women namely because of the culture of the day. day. Men would hunt and women would reap the fields. Demeter's chief festival was at the harvest time, and it happened once every 5 years and lasted for 9 days. Businesses would close down, songs and dance would occur along with sacrifices. A well-known story is the one with Demeter and Hades and how they went head to head. Demeter's daughter Persephone was kidnapped by Hades, and in her grief Demeter withheld her powers of the field, thus turning fields into a desert land. She disguised herself as an old woman on earth. She would nurse the son of Celsius, Damophone, where she would anoint him with ambrosia and place him in a fire, trying to give him immortal youth. But that would not be the end, and instead the child would just get a very honor-filled life and would have a temple built of her so she could wallow in her anger and grief at not seeing her daughter. Zeus would eventually step in and try to get Demeter to do her job, and due to Hades' slick mind, Persephone couldn't escape him forever, but a deal was reached with him where Persephone would be allowed to see her mom every spring. These arrangements led to what we call the creation of the seasons. Dionysus would be worshipped alongside Demeter. Dionysus' festival was associated with the grape harvest, which led to the grapes being brought to the winepress. Both Demeter and Dionysus were known for their grief, as they were seen as being depressed when the fields came in. Dionysus was the son of Zeus and Theban princess named Semele. Zeus got her pregnant and swore a sacred oath to give her whatever she wanted. Hera found out and made her wish to see Zeus in all of his glory, and once he did, she died. Zeus would snatch the child still inside of her before then, and would put the child in his own side away from Hera until it was time for it to be born, and then gave him up to the nymphs of Nicaea. Dionysus was born of fire and cared for by rain, which reflects how heat ripens grapes and water keeps it alive. Dionysus would grow up and teach men of grapes and was considered a god. He would go on many adventures, one where he got kidnapped by sailors and he ended up filling their ships with vines. He would turn himself into a lion to scare them off the boat and turn the sailors into dolphins. Another is he would get insulted by Lycurgus, a king of Greece, but Zeus would have his back and make Lycurgus blind and die. He would travel to the underworld and help free his mom from death and have her become one with the gods. Dionysus would, like the other gods, have his flaws and came from the fact that wine can be good or bad depending on who drinks it. His worship included savage brutality, showing how wine could make men crazy. He was known for being man's blessing and man's disaster. The worst thing he arguably did was in his encounter with the king Pentheus of Thebes. Pentheus did not believe Dionysus to be a god and imprisoned Dionysus. Dionysus in response would turn the Theban women, including Pentheus' mother and sisters, and he would turn them insane against Pentheus as he was trying to pursue Dionysus' followers, and would have them kill Pentheus. Dionysus was well loved, and people considered being able to drink wine as a way of being like him. Like other natural gods, Dionysus died and rose again as the seasons did in a way similar to the vine, aka getting torn to pieces. His death and being brought back to life also symbolized how the soul lives on after death. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today I'll be telling you a couple of stories of love and adventure in mythology. First up, we got Cupid and Psyche. Psyche was a beautiful woman with goddess-like looks, whom got guys' attention. She was so beautiful that the goddess of beauty, Venus, got less attention. Venus was peeved by this, and ordered Cupid to make Psyche fall in love with the ugliest man in the world. But plans changed as Cupid fell in love with Psyche. While men liked looking at Psyche, that's all they were interested in, and they didn't want to marry her. She'd go to a hilltop before being carried away by a wind to a mansion where she stayed for a while. She had been told her husband would be the man who got her from the hilltop, but she never got to really see him during her stay. Psyche wanted a husband real bad and fell for Cupid, and when Cupid told her not to look at him, she took it seriously and said she didn't want to be without him. Psyche would see her sisters despite being told that it would lead to bad results. Cupid was right, as her sisters would see her wealth and get filled with jealousy and sought to ruin her relationship. They do this by lying to her and telling her that Cupid really wasn't a man but a serpent out to get her. That's why they said he didn't show himself to her. Psyche would go to kill him, but would find out after seeing him in bed that he was a beautiful man, and Cupid left and ran away because she broke her deal to not look at him. She'd vowed to spend the rest of her life, if need be, to show her love for him. She'd make herself a servant of Venus, hoping to win back Cupid. Venus would torment her with seemingly impossible tasks, all of which she had gotten help to complete. She'd at the end get knocked out after opening a box with a quote on, quote, beauty from Persephone. Cupid would find her and wake her up and got Jupiter, aka Zeus, to formally recognize the wedding, thus making sure Venus could no longer hurt her. Jupiter would give her ambrosia, which made Psyche immortal, and would have her stay in heaven, thus both giving Psyche happiness and making sure that Venus wouldn't have to worry about men not worshiping her due to Psyche's beauty. Next story of love, we got the tale of Pygmalion and Galatea. Pygmalion was a capricious, sexist sculptor whom initially detested women so much that he would make a female statue for the sole purpose of showing men how ugly their women were. He worked hard on the statue, and shockingly enough, he made it so beautiful he fell in love with it. He'd be upset because she wouldn't respond to his affection, and longed for her to be real. He'd ultimately give up, but he would still think about it. Pygmalion would go to Venus on feast day and asked her for a maiden like his statue, but Venus knew he wanted his statue alive, and so she did make her alive, and Pygmalion married the now named maiden and former statue Galatea. First adventure story of the day is the tale of the quest of the Golden Fleece. The Greek king Athamius abandoned his wife Nephele and got married to Princess Inu. Neph was worried that her sons were in danger because Inu would want her children to become king. Neph was right, and Inu did try to get Phrixus killed as a way to stop the Greek kingdom from starving. When Phrixus was brought to the altar, a ram with a golden fleece around it came and rescued him. The ram brought him to the Colchis country, where he was taken in by the people, and the king Edith let him marry one of his daughters. To thank the ram for saving his life, he killed it and sacrificed it to Zeus, and gave the golden fleece to Hades. Phrixus' uncle, who was by rights king in Greece, got his lands taken from him by Peleus. This uncle had a son named Jason, who would become the star of this tale. Jason was fated to kill Peleus, as he had only a single sandal on, and that is what the oracle had told Peleus to look out for. Jason did not know about the oracle's prophecy, and in his first encounter with Peleus, he offered a peace deal where Peleus got to keep all of his wealth while the throne would have to be given to him after it. Peleus agreed to the deal only if Jason could get the golden fleece, which he believed to be a suicide mission. Jason agreed to do it as he was all for adventure, and he had recruited several men who would become main stars in this tale, and members of the Argonauts, aka Hercules, Orpheus, Castor, Pollux, and Peleus. They rode in the ship called Argo. They traveled very far, first off to Lemnos, where the women killed off most of the men except for one man whom was the king. They were nice to the Argonauts and gave them food and drinks. Hercules would be taken out of the game when he had to rescue his armor bearer from a water nymph, and thus had to leave his crew and didn't come back. The Argonauts would fight off the Harpies next, after being told the backstory of Phineus, a man gifted by Apollo with prophecy and cursed by Zeus with harpies who would ruin his food. Callias and Zetes would try to kill the harpies before being stopped by Iris, the rainbow messenger, and told them the harpies would never bother Phineus again. Phineus would give them advice about sending a dove through the clashing rocks in order to see if it was good to pass through, and they used the advice to help them pass through, and the clashing rocks were now able to be passed through by everyone. The Argonauts would pass through the country of the Amazons before heading to Colchis where the Golden Fleece was at. They knew things were not looking good and felt there would be no help for them. Hera proved them wrong on that and arranged for Cupid to get Medea the magic wielder and King Odysseus' daughter to fall in love with Jason. Hera would also put a mist around the Argonauts so they could reach the land undetected when they approached the king's palace. They have a big feast with the king and told him who they were and what they wanted. Jason offered to provide any service Ides wanted in exchange for the Golden Fleece. Ides didn't like them and would have killed them if they hadn't ate at his table. Ides gave Jason the task of yoking 2 bulls and defeat dragon-teeth men. Jason would get Medea to help him conquer the task with her magic skills. She gave him ointment that would give him immense strength and told him about throwing a huge stone in the way of the dragon-teeth men so they would kill each other. Overall, it worked. King Hades still didn't plan on giving them the Golden Fleece, and the fleece was guarded by a snake. Medea would help them find it and would put the snake in a deep sleep with a lullaby. Jason grabbed the Golden Fleece and they took off. Hades would send Medea's brother Apistorus, but Medea would bring about his death by tricking him and having Jason killing him. With all of that out of the way, the Argonauts would go through their other trials, like going through the whirlwind of Charybdis, which they did through help from Hera, and they defeated the Bronze Man through help of Medea's magic. The Argonauts would go back to Greece and disband, and Jason with Medea and the Golden Fleece would help out Peleus, who drove Jason's father to suicide, and Jason's mother, who died out of grief over Jason's father. Jason would get Medea to kill Peleus by tricking his daughters into killing him by making them think it would make Peleus young again. Now, despite all the good that Medea did for him, whom even made herself an exile for him, and in fact had promised to marry her, Jason betrayed her and got married to Chrysia, the daughter of the king of Corinth, to strengthen his political ties. Jason told her that he had repaid her by making sure she would only be exiled and not killed, and gave her plenty of gold and resources so she could be set on her exile. Jason also informed her that Aphrodite made her fall in love with him, that she should be grateful to him, and that he helped her reputation by having her being known as the person who helped the Argonauts. Medea took revenge and killed Jason's wife by having her wear a poisoned dress, which also killed the king because he had tried saving his daughter, and Medea would kill the 2 children she had with Jason in order to not risk them being enslaved, tortured, or killed by Jason himself. Medea would take off, and because he had broke his vow to Medea, Hera abandoned him. He became a mess and would go to the now decaying rot of the Argo ship to sleep to relieve his good moments, and would die when a beam fell from the ship onto him. The last story of the day is the tale of Pegasus and Bellerophon. Bellerophon was supposedly the son of either the cursed king Glaucus or the god Poseidon. I go for the interpretation that Poseidon was his father due to the tale's emphasis on Beller's body and the fact that his mom was taught by Athena and was overall a peer of the gods. Beller wanted the great horse Pegasus from early on. Pegasus was a divine horse that sprang from Gorgon's blood. He was told by the wise seer Polyidus to sleep at Athena's temple in the chance that the gods would talk to him, and he'd have Athena appear in front of him. She'd give him a golden bridle so he could find and ride Pegasus. He'd fly through the air, and this would be the start of his journey. Beller would accidentally kill his brother and would go to Protus, the king of Argos, to be forgiven, where he would be turned down, and he would turn down the advances of the queen, whom would tell the king he wronged her, which would get the king to send Beller to deliver a letter to the king of Lycia, which, unbeknownst to Beller, told the king of Lycia to kill him. King Lycia did not want to break the Greek rule of hospitality and thus sent Beller on a dangerous journey to kill the Chimera, so if anything the blood wouldn't be on his hands. With Pegasus flying him, he didn't have to worry about the monster hurting him a lot, and he successfully killed it. Beller would conquer mighty warrior tribes such as the Salmi and the Amazons, which won him the friendships of Protus and would get him a daughter to marry. Beller's pride, though, is what got the best of him, as he thought he was more than a mere mortal and could take his place amongst the gods, and tried to have Pegasus fly him to Olympus, but Pegasus would throw him off, refusing to go on his trip. Beller would become a traveler, depressed from the events, and avoided men until his death. On the bright side, Pegasus was brought to Olympus, where he become the official horse for Zeus. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello there everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today I'm going to talk to you about the Trojan War and some more. So before we go over the Trojan War, it is important to know heroes that predate it. So here's two of them, Perseus and Atalanta. To talk about Perseus, it is helpful to talk about the events leading up to his birth. Perseus was the son of Danae and Zeus in the form of a shower of gold. Danae's father, King Acrisius of Argos, did not want his daughter to get pregnant because he had been fated to be killed by the boy whom she birthed. The only reason Acrisius didn't kill Dana was because he was worried of what the gods would do to him if he did so he instead chose to lock her up and she'd become pregnant anyway by Zeus. Acrisius would, instead of killing them, would lock them in a chest and push them out to sea, in which they would be miraculously found by a fisherman named Dictys, whom took them in and cared for them for years. Not all would be as good as Dictys' brother, Polydeuces, who was the ruler of the little island of Seraphoms, whom wanted Dana for a wife but didn't want her son, so to fix that had Perseus go on what he thought was a suicide mission to fight the monstrous Gorgons. Perseus would promise to do one better and kill the most well-known one, Medusa, by chopping off her head. She was the only mortal one, so that was a good choice in hindsight. Like a lot of Greek stories, Perseus got help from the gods, in this case Hermes and Athena. Hermes and Athena would give him a powerful sword and shield. The shield was made out of a polished bronze, which meant it was reflective, and he was told to look into the shield in order to see Medusa through a reflection so he wouldn't have to look directly at her and risk getting turned into stone. He found his way there and killed Medusa without having to look directly at her. Perseus would head back home, but would find out that a princess named Andromeda was chained to a rocky ledge for her claims of being more beautiful than the daughters of the sea god Nereus. She was a sacrifice to a large sea serpent in order to stop her fellow citizens from being killed by the beast. Perseus would cut off the sea serpent's head and would marry Andromeda. Perseus would sail back to Seriphos and would find out his mom had been abused by Polydeuces for refusing to marry him. Perseus would march to the king's banquet and would shock everyone with his presence, and even more so when he whipped out Medusa's head and turned them all into stone. Dictys would become king, and Perseus and his family would sail back to Acrisius to try to reconcile with him, but would find out that he had been chased out of the city. Later on, Perseus would take part in a discus throwing contest in which he would accidentally kill Acrisius with it, and the prophecy was fulfilled. Next up, we have Atalanta. Atalanta was born to a cruel father named Chephinus. Atalanta was a baby who would be ditched on a mountainside to die from the cold and hunger. She'd be taken in and raised by a she-bear for a couple years before kind hunters took her in. She would be taught how to use a bow, and she would kill 2 centaurs as a young girl. She was a tomboy through and through, as she wasn't very maidenlike and liked hunting with the guys. Atalanta also, unlike many girls, had no desire for marriage. An adventure she is known for is her boar hunt. One day, King Oeneus of Calydon was plagued with a great Calydon boar because he had forgotten to sacrifice the first fruits of the harvest to Artemis. This boar went wild on the land and killed many people, and eventually the king would gather the bravest men in Greece to try to kill the boar. In the end, after many men died, the king's son Maleger and Atalanta were able to kill the boar. Maleger had fallen in love with her, but Atalanta just seen him as a friend. This was a good thing overall, as Maleger's mom would later end up killing Maleger later on after Maleger had killed his uncles for complaining about him giving Atalanta the prized boar skin from the hunt. Atalanta would go on many adventures and would end up beating Peleus, aka Achilles' father, in a wrestling match. She, like always, would not want to get married and would only agree to get married if the man could beat her in a foot race. Atalanta knew there was no man alive who could do it. Hippomenes would take up the challenge and would resort to cheating by using 3 golden apples to distract her, and so they would marry. They would have a son before being turned into lions after they had sex in Zeus's temple. Now that we got the pre-heroes out of the way, let's get into the Trojan War. The Trojan War basically started over a trick done by the goddess of discord, Eris. To get revenge for not being invited to King Peleus' wedding, she threw a golden apple marked "to the fairest," which got Aphrodite, Hera, and Pallas into a fight over who deserved it. They tried to get Zeus to decide, but he outsourced that job to an exiled young prince, Paris. The goddesses would all offer him bribes, but he would choose Aphrodite, and his choice was set. And this would all lead up to what we we now know as the Trojan War. Aphrodite wasn't the fairest woman, though, as that went to Helen, who is the daughter of Zeus and Leda. So many men wanted her for marriage that her father King Tyrannus feared by choosing one of them that one of them would not unite against him. The king would choose Mythos, the brother of Agamemnon, and would be made the king of Sparta. Paris would go to Mythos as a guest, and because Aphrodite promised Paris the most beautiful girl, Helen, they would end up kidnapping her while Mythos was away. When Mythos came back and seen Helen gone, he would call Greece to help him. He'd find his best men, aka the wise king of the island of Ithaca, Odysseus, and Achilles, the son of Peleus. Odysseus didn't want to go to war and pretended to be insane, but the messenger would put his son in danger to prove Odysseus was sane. Achilles was also held back, but not by choice, as his mom kept him from war for a while because Achilles' mom feared for his life. Odysseus would get Achilles to join. Achilles knew he was destined to die if he went to war, but he wanted glory and to be remembered. This was a very honor-like culture, if you did not know. There would be what you could say injustices carried out, which would have repercussions down the line. Commander-in-chief of the Greek army, Agamemnon, sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia in order to get Artemis to give them calm winds to travel to Troy. The gods hated people who spilled the blood of their family, and so this would come back to bite Agamemnon later on down the road. The Greeks would go against the strong Trojan city with the king and queen of Troy, Priam and Hecuba, whom would have a strong son named Hector. Hector and Achilles would battle each other down the line, and both men knew they were destined to die and gave up alternative options. Greece and Troy would battle each other for almost a decade, with neither side getting an edge, but an event happened that favored the Trojans. The god Phobos, Apollo, would kill many of the Greek men in Agamemnon's group due to a conflict between the commander Agamemnon and Achilles over the girl Chryseis, whom neither would release in spite of the priestly father wanting her gone. They would please the god by giving up the girl to her dad, but Agamemnon would get Achilles maiden in exchange, and that obviously didn't bode well with their relationship. Hercules' mom would go to Zeus and get him to help the Trojans out, and would pull Achilles from the fight temporarily. Ajax and Diomedes would become the better fighters for Greeks. Diomedes would have an impressive feats in his record. He would wound Aphrodite when she saved her son Prince Aeneas, and would wound the war god Ares and send him away from Troy. Paris and Mythos would meet in battle. All of this was over Helen, where Mythos would get the better of Paris till Aphrodite saved him. Generally, a victory like this would allow the winner to take his prize, aka in this case Helen, but Hera wanted the war to continue until Troy was ruined, and Athena made a Trojan man named Pandarus break a truce between the two by wounding Mythos with an arrow he fired. Achilles and Hector would do battle, and this was seen as an important fight, and it was so important that Zeus ordered the other gods to stay in Olympus during it. To get Achilles to come back, Agamemnon had to try to make amends. Odysseus couldn't buy him back. It wasn't until his beloved friend Patroclus died fighting against the Trojan army in Achilles' armor by Hector that Achilles decided to come back. Hector would take the armor and wear it, showing a great deal of disrespect to Achilles. Achilles would lead his men and confront Hector, and they battled. Achilles knew the flaws in his own armor and knew where the openings were at and took advantage of it. Achilles would drive his spear into Hector's throat, killing him. Hector would ask Achilles to honorably give his body back to his parents before he died, but Achilles would refuse and sought to shame Hector. He pierced the dead Hector's feet with roped hooks, fastened the rope to the back of his chariot, and went away, dragging Hector's corpse in front of his family. Eventually, Hector's father Priam would convince Achilles to get Hector's body back after a good conversation. The battle would be postponed in order to allow the Trojans to mourn his loss and go through the funeral. Achilles would die later on from an Apollo-guided bow to the heel by Paris. The heel was his weakness because it was the only part of him not dumped into the river Styx by his mom in order to make him powerful. Achilles would be given a funeral, but his armor would still cause trouble. In a vote for who would get the armor, Odysseus won and Ajax felt dishonored by that. He'd be driven into a rage, wanting to kill Agamemnon and Melnius, but Athena turned his rage into insanity, which made him believe that the animals there were the Greek army, and he killed them, beating a huge ram, whom he thought was Odysseus, to death. When he came to his senses, he would realize he had dishonored himself more than not getting the armor ever would. He'd commit suicide via sword to the chest and would be buried instead of being honorably burned. Paris would also die, but at the hands of Philoctetes, with the bows and the neglect of his first wife, Dione. He'd be wounded by the bows, and his first wife would refuse to heal him and watched him die before she killed herself. This was because Paris abandoned her to be with Helen. His death was of no loss to Troy. Troy would fall after Odysseus realized that the walls of Troy were strong, and even after 10 years of attacks they held. Odysseus realized if they can't penetrate the walls, they could find another way into the city. So he had a giant wooden horse built as a surrender gift, which would be seen as an offering to Athena. In reality, the horse would have Greek men sneaked inside of it, whom would wait until the Trojans left the horse inside and went to bed themselves, so the Greek men could jump out and ransack the city, killing everyone and burning the city. Achilles' son would strike down the king of Troy, Priam, right in front of his wife and daughters. All that would be left of the Troy would be the widows of the men killed and some of the children, all of whom were waiting to be made slaves. Hector's wife Atramedes' child, Asterix, would be killed by being thrown off the wall of Troy in order to make sure the child wouldn't grow up to get revenge. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello there everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today I'm going to talk to you about Odysseus and the great families of mythology. The story of Odysseus' travels go beyond the Trojan War. Due to angering a bunch of gods who had bets on the other team, Greek fleets would receive trouble. Athena and Poseidon would team up to make any Greek ship sink and blow them off course. This was due also to the Greeks using the wooden horse, which was supposed to be an offering to Athena, so the whole event seemed bad. Odysseus would suffer longer than any other Greeks, as he was left wandering for 10 years, being trapped on Ogygia by the nymph Calypso before coming home to see his son grown up. He had been away from home for 20 years. During his coming back from Troy, he had went to the land of lotus eaters with his men, whom he had to force back because they ate the lotus, which made them high, and he got into a fight with the Cyclops, which were related to the gods, and started a whole feud with him and Poseidon over that. And Poseidon vowed not to let him come home until he had suffered. He had also had a bag of winds from King Aeolus, which his crew members screwed up and got him into more trouble. Odysseus also dealt with the giant cannibals known as the Lystragons, which destroyed all of Odysseus' ships which Odysseus was in, except the one that Odysseus was in, I could say. He'd go to Aea, the realm of Circe, a dangerous witch whom turned a lot of his men to animals until Odysseus would convince Circe to turn them back. He'd stay for a year before going to the underworld in order to try to get home safer. In said underworld, he'd have to deal with blood-drinking spirits whom he'd have to keep away. He'd also meet Ajax and Achilles there. After that, he'd avoid the sirens by having his crew members plug their ears, while he himself tied himself to the boat so he could hear it himself without causing problems. Lastly, his men would kill the sacred oxen they had got, and Zeus would strike the ship down, killing all the men but Odysseus. It was after floating in the water for a while that he stumbled onto Calypso's island, whom held him there as a love and a prisoner for many years. Odysseus' wife Penelope would remain faithful to her husband despite it being widely assumed Odysseus was dead, and thus would reject so many marriage offers, but the rude and greedy man stayed in her house and refused to leave till she chose one of them, which meant resources were being eaten up, which also annoyed Odysseus' son Telemachus. Telemachus. After 10 years, Athena's anger towards Odysseus faded, and she felt sorry for having caused so much trouble for him and decided to have the Olympians help out. Hermes was sent by Zeus to get Calypso to release Odysseus, which she would, and would get Odysseus to leave the island via a raft. Poseidon would still try to kill Odysseus, but he'd receive help to get safety to land owned by the good people, the Phoceans. He'd become friends with the Nicesians, the daughter of King Alcyoneus, whom would get him help from her parents. Odysseus would tell them and others his stories. Alcyoneus assured him his troubles were over and brought Odysseus home to Ithaca. Athena, disguised as a shepherd lad, would tell him he was in Ithaca. She would reveal herself after a talk and talk to him about the men wanting to marry his wife, and said she'd help him out. Odysseus would finally meet his son Telemachus, whom just came back from Sparta. Odysseus would go back to his house and would see his dog again, who felt like his life was completed after seeing his master after so long. Afterwards, the old dog died. He wouldn't reveal himself to his wife though for a while. Penelope would set up a contest to see who would be her husband. The contest would be whomever could use Odysseus' bow and arrow to shoot an arrow through 12 rings in a line would be her new husband. She knew only Odysseus could do that. Odysseus, still disguised as a poor beggar, got the bow and put the arrow through the rings before turning the arrow on the suitors. The suitors didn't have no weapons, as Odysseus had arranged for them to be taken away, and he blocked the exits. Odysseus and Telemachus would kill all the suitors. Odysseus would reunite with his wife, and all would be well. Now let's talk about the famous families of mythology. First off, let's talk about the cursed house of Atreus. Agamemnon was the commander of the Greek forces and the son of the king Atreus of Mycenae. He'd weathered through the harsh storm that wrecked other ships and came home. As I mentioned earlier, Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia in order to have a safe journey to Troy. Agamemnon was part of a cursed family because his great-grandfather Tantalus killed his son and tried to feed him to the gods. Tantalus would be thrown into Tartarus, aka the underworld. Agamemnon, when he came back, it was known that to everyone except maybe Ag himself that there was trouble coming for his actions and vengeance would be given to him. Because of his deeds, his wife Clytemnestra decided to be unfaithful to Ag and took a lover named Augustus, aka Ag's cousin. Ag and his wife would speak, and when everyone was gone, Cly and Augustus ambushed him and stabbed him through the chest with a sword. Cly and Augustus ruled together until Ag's son Orestes killed them both, despite knowing that it would lead to his ruin because he had to avenge his father's murder. He'd become a wanderer, plagued with suffering afterwards, and would later on ask the gods for forgiveness and to be atoned for his sin, something no one in his house had done up to that point. Orestes was acquitted and the curse ended. Next is the story of Oedipus in the house of Thebes. Oedipus is the son of the king of Thebes, Laius. He didn't have a really easy life, as he was left on a mountain as a baby to die in order so he could avoid Apollo's prophecy of him getting killed by his son. Oedipus would be found on the mountain when would be taken in by the king of Corinth, Polybus. Oedipus would be told by Apollo that he would murder his father and marry his mother. Upon hearing that, Oedipus took that to mean he'd murder Polybus, as he assumed that was his dad. He'd leave and become a wanderer, seeking to stop the prophecy from coming true. During his wandering, he would find the Sphinx and solve its riddle of what goes on 4 feet in the morning, 2 at the noonday, and 3 in the evening, by saying man. With the riddle solved, the Sphinx killed herself, and the Thebians were saved. He was made the king of Thebes and married the dead king's wife, Jocasta. A great plague would happen in the lands, and as Apollo had told, would come only to be cleared if Laius' murder would be punished. Oedipus sought to find who murdered Laius, and found out from the blind prophet Tiresias that Oedipus killed Laius. It turned out that Oedipus had killed Laius when Laius and his 4 attendants tried to force Oedipus on his path. Jocasta brought up how Laius was prophesied to die at the hand of his son, and Oedipus realized the prophecy he had been told, and things came together. Oedipus killed his father, aka Laius, and married his mother, aka Jocasta, and the prophecy was fulfilled. Upon the revelation, Jocasta killed herself and Oedipus gouged out his eyes. Next up is the tale of Procreus and Cepheus, and it's an exciting one. Procreus was the daughter of the king Eurystheus of Athens, and she married to Cepheus, whom was the grandson of Alius, the king of winds. While their marriage was happy, Cepheus was a lover on the run and became attached to Aura, the goddess of the dawn, and would take a long absence from home. Aura fell in love with him, but Cephalus, while he had feelings for Aurora, couldn't find it in his heart to cheat on Procris. He loved Procris too much. Aurora was mad and suggested to Cephalus that his wife isn't as faithful as he is. Cephalus would reasonably get mad at this and sought to prove Procris would remain faithful to him. He did so by disguising himself as another person, and it was all so well done that no one could believe it was him. Despite all of his advancement and telling her that her husband, aka himself, had forsaken her, she did not budge. She wouldn't cheat. She would never give in to him, but she would be more open to him, and that is when Cephalus revealed himself to her and gave her a verbal lashing. Procris left the house. After a while, Cephalus felt bad and went to the mountains, but where she went to ask for forgiveness. Eventually, they would make up for it, but in the end, after a hunting trip gone wrong, Cephalus accidentally killed Procris with a javelin, mistaking her for an animal. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today I'm going to talk to you about Norse mythology. Now that we've touched on Greek and Roman mythology, let's get into Norse mythology. Norse mythology is very different from the previously mentioned. Asgard is where the gods live, and it doesn't match heaven as we would imagine it would. No joy is to be found in Asgard, or the assurance of bliss, but rather a threat of inevitable doom. Unlike the gods in Greek and Roman culture, the Norse gods weren't immortal and they died. They knew one day they'd fall to their enemies, but the fighting in the face of this fact was a key thing. The gods knew they'd ultimately lose, but if they could postpone that for a little while longer, they would. This was a value very much shared by the Norse people. If they were to battle and died, they'd rather die resisting. A brave death will give a person a seat in Valhalla, aka one of the halls of Asgard, but even Asgard will fall alongside the gods one day. Heroism to a Norse man is not about necessarily conquering evil, but to resist evil even when you're losing. Norse mythology does allow for free will in the sense that the hero can choose between yielding to the enemy or dying. Sad to say, a lot of the traditions and stories of the Norse people were obliterated by Christians who hated paganism. Pieces of it exist, like in the form of Beowulf and Nibelungiled. If it weren't for the two Icelandic Eddas, knowledge of the Norse religion would be virtually non-existent. One of the most important works is the Elder Edda, which is the oldest manuscript, being dated around 300 years after Christians arrived, but the poems maintain much of their pagan culture. It is made up of separate poems and is written sort of awkwardly. It talks of men who've seen victory in death. The Younger Edda has its perks. It was written down in the last part of the 12th century by Snorri Sturluson, and it contains prehistoric mythological material which the Elder Edda lacked. To a Norseman, the Greek gods could never be heroic because they were immortal and by and far pretty much invincible, which meant they didn't have to defy danger. The Norse gods, however, were braved, were faced with threats of giants, and assured their defeat eventually. Odin was the big guy in charge. Odin is a rather strange figure amongst the gods, as while he sits in at the feast of the gods, he doesn't join in with eating. Odin has two ravens on his shoulders that travel through the world each day in order to bring back news of what each man does. Odin's main responsibility was to postpone Ragnarok, aka the Day of Doom. Odin hungers for wisdom and is seen sacrificing his well-being to obtain it. This is the case when he traded his eye for wisdom to Mimir the Wise. he'd give knowledge that he won by suffering to men. Odin had attendants called Valkyries, whom would go to the battlefield and decide who should win and who should die. Heroes would be brought to Valhalla. Odin's son Balder was considered most beloved of the gods, which is why when he died, it marked the first of the disasters on the gods. Frigga, his mother, went through the world beforehand to get an oath from all living things and non-living things to not harm Balder. She'd missed the mistletoe though, and Loki would trick Balder's blind brother Hoder into killing him by throwing said mistletoe at Balder, which pierced Balder's heart. Nanna, his wife, would die during Balder's funeral, and her body was placed on the great ship with him, which was lit on fire. Loki would be punished by being bound in a cavern with hot snake venom being poured on him every day. While goddesses were typically not seen as important as say they were in Greek tales, a goddess by the name Hela ruled the kingdom of death, which no god had authority over but her. Even Odin had no rule over it. Norse mythology did have a creation story. Basically, at first there was a chasm that didn't extend everywhere. To the north of it was Niflheim, the realm of the dead, and to the south was Muspelheim, the realm of fire. The Niflheim rivers would flow into the chasm, and it would be turned into ice, and the Muspelheim would turn some of that ice into mist. This mist would create water droplets that would form the first giant, Ymir, and the first frost maidens. Ymir would have a son whom we now know to be Odin. Odin and his brothers would kill Ymir and fashion the earth, sky, sea, earth, and heavens from his body. They'd take sparks from the Muspelheim to make the stars and the moon. The first man and woman were created from trees, man from ash and women from elm. Norse mythos also contained dwarfs, elves, and a giant ash tree named Yggdrasil, which supported the universe, and it went through the worlds. Another well was the Well of Knowledge, which was guarded by Mimir the Wise. The Yggdrasil had a holy well named Yurda's Well that was guarded by Yurda, Verdani, and Skuld, aka past, present, and future. The ash tree was doomed for destruction as a giant serpent chewed continuously at the root of the tree, hoping to topple it and bring down the universe. Jotunheim Frost and mountain giants were enemies of the gods and were powerful creatures in their own right. Even though everything was doomed, there was a bit of hope as the destruction of the world at Ragnarok would bring about a whole new other realm where the new gods would come about that would be more powerful than Odin and be all good. To wrap up here, the story of Signy and Sigurd. Signy was the daughter of Volsung, the king of Hanaland. Signy's husband, the Geatish king Siggeir, would kill her father and capture his sons so they one by one could be eaten by wolves. Signy managed to save one by the name of Sigmund, and they vowed to avenge their family. Signy would be unfaithful to her murderous husband and disguise herself to sleep with Sigmund and bared him a son named Sinfjötl, whom Signy gave to him after his birth and Sigmund raised to adulthood. During the years of Sinfjötl's time, Signy would still keep up her relations with Siggeir and bear him children, not showing him her secret that she wanted revenge. On the day of revenge, Sigmund and his son launched a surprise attack on the house, killing the children of Signy, and burned the house with Signy trapped inside. Signy would tell them during the attack that they had avenged the dead, and Signy would step into the burning house to die. The story of Sigurd can be briefly told. Basically, a Valkyrie named Brynhild disobeyed Odin and was punished with sleep until a man who knows no fear woke her. To show this, Odin surrounded the couch she was on with a fire that only a hero could brave through. Sigmund's son Sigurd would be the one for the job and would wake Brynhild. This would prove to be fruitless as he'd be made to forget about her by the King's king Gunnar's mother, Grimhild, and marry Gunrun. Brynhild would wind up in that spot again, and Sigurd, in the form of Gunnar, though through magic by Grimhild, would save her again, but this time for Gunnar, and make her think Sigurd had cheated. Brynhild would learn the truth through a dispute with Sigurd's wife Gunrun, and planned her revenge. Brynhild would tell Gunnar that if he didn't kill Sigurd, she'd leave him, and Gunnar, wanting to hold to his brotherhood oath with Sigurd, got his younger brother to do it while Sigurd was asleep, thus leaving Gudrun to wake up in her husband's blood. Brynhild would later kill herself because of it. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello there everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today I'm going to go over bonus myths, legends, and folktales. Abba comes from North American Indian mythology and was a creator god. Basically, there was a mountain that had a passage from the top to the caverns under the earth. These caverns arose the Choctaws, along with ants. Choctaws killed the ant's mother and called on Abba to close the exit of the mountain, locking remaining people in there, and later transformed the people into ants. Second up, we got Daksha, known in Hindu mythology and is one of the sons of the god Brahma, whom sprang from his right thumb. He is known for his attempt at populating the world. He had tried to populate the world, but it didn't work at first. He had 2,000 sons with his wife Askingni, but they didn't produce any offspring. He overall had 5,000 children, whom would be called the Haryashwas. Dietrich of Bern is a medieval legend based on the king Theodoric the Great. Dietrich was the king of the Ostrogoths, whom was born under Dinyar and Odilia. As a child, he scorched objects nearby with his angry flame breath. Dietrich would train under the Volsung Hildebrand. He'd go on to slay the giants Grim and Hild with his magic sword, the Nagelring, placing his sword between the severed parts of the Hildring afterwards in order to prevent regeneration. He'd fight more giants and defeat them. He'd also go on to rescue his friend Dietlieb's sister, Kunhild, from the powerful dwarf Alberich, whom had magic armor and weapons to fight with. Dietrich had been convinced by Alberich to be treated to a supper by him, and Alberich would drug his wine, putting them to sleep and allowing Alberich to put them in prison. Dietrich would use his fire breath to cut the ropes and escape with Kunhild. He'd have a great battle with Alberich, ultimately coming out on top, but Kunhild would have Dietrich spare Alberich's life. Many other stories would be told about these people, and this is just on the top of the ones mentioned. Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was the king of Uruk in Mesopotamia, who appears in many languages, which are incorporated in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Some Near Eastern scholars believe Gilgamesh is a historical person and these legends came after his death. It is unknown exactly who is Gilgamesh's father. Some saying an idiot, some saying a priest, or some saying a shepherd god, Lugabanda. I go for Lugabanda since it appears in the epic poem. Gilgamesh was created by the gods to be stronger and have more courage than other men. He was so wonderful that he sought a companion like himself. Gilgamesh was known for using his godlike powers to oppress his people with harsh laws and forced labor, and it was ensured no one could challenge him due to the powers he had been given. Eventually, people after suffering for many years called upon the god Aruyo to create a rival for him, aka Enkidu. Enkidu would know nothing about the civilization or how men were and lived amongst animals. Gilgamesh would hear from a hunter about Enkidu, whom he commanded to get him a temple prostitute for Enkidu. The prostitute would sleep with Enkidu for about a week, which would make Enkidu like one of the gods since he experienced sexual desire. Enkidu and Gilgamesh would fight and realize they were equally matched, and that Gilgamesh finally got his friend that he wanted. Gilgamesh, with his friend, would become less harsh on his people, and peace would be established for a while. Gilgamesh and Enkidu would go around on many adventures, like killing the monster Humbaya, and the sacred cedar tree it guarded, and the bull of heaven, which came from Gilgamesh rejecting the goddess Ishtar. Enkidu would be killed by the gods through a shameful death. Gilgamesh would leave his home, and he'd seek to find a way to become immortal after this. Gilgamesh would go to the land of Unipisan, where he'd be directed to a plant that would renew his youth, but sadly the plant was stolen by a snake. Gilgamesh would realize that death was for everyone and returned home. Next up, we have John Henry, who was an American folklore about a black hero who lived in Black River country. The earliest tales can go to the 1870s with hammer songs. He had a black preacher voice and was known as a strong man. John was known for his work ethic, and his most famous tale in involves him defeating a steam drill and dying from exhaustion afterwards. Next up, we have Kaidku Jabal, who is a stone god in Lapland mythology. He had a ritual where a male reindeer had its right ear pierced with a red thread running through it. Its blood was preserved in a barrel where a priest took the blood and fat and anointed an idol with it. This guaranteed the worshipper good hunting. Nzanga is found in African mythology and was a hero notable for capturing death. In African mythology, Babunda of Angalia, for noted reasons, was a hero who captured death. Nzanga captured death because he believed that death had killed his brother. Death explained that he didn't kill people, but rather people did that themselves and he merely collected them. Nzanga would go to the land of the dead and seen his brother living a good life there. He'd go back home and was given seeds to plant. Later on, death would kill him by throwing an axe at him. Perdo was a young hunter from Armenia who lost his way and ended up face to face with Shire Mar, the king of snakes. Shire Mar had the body of a snake with a man's head. Perdo befriends the snake king and gives him water, and Shire Mar in return gives him a valuable stone which Perdo uses to pay off debts. He goes back to the cave and does the same thing and gets the same back. Perdo would later be tortured by a doctor looking to find the cure from the magical snake for the ruler of the Kilkia Kenyan. Sharmar would tell Perdo how to make the healing cure from flowers and through cutting off his head to make 2 potions from the right side and the left side of the head. One potion from that would be poisonous and the other would be the one that heals. Perdo would give the poison one to the doctor who died and would give the healing one to Kenyan who recovered. Perdo would then be known as Lochman, the wise father of medicine. Perdo would become the king of the snakes and take on a disabled youth as his assistant. It would turn out that an 8-legged creature was inside the youth's head, which Perdo removed. The assistant would run away for a bit before Perdo would find him in his own dying years. The assistant would be given a chance to make a special potion that restores Perdo's life, but would fail and Perdo died. The assistant would become a healer much later on and would die as well. Rajai was a man who took the throne of the storm god Indra. Brahman declaimed victory would be given to Raja's side in a war between the gods and demons. The gods would make a better deal that made him their king, and the demons would be defeated. Raja would be made king and made Indra the deputy of heaven. After Raja died, Indra refused to acknowledge Raja's son's right to the throne and took it to himself. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is another Red Pill Religion podcast, and tonight we're going to be talking about mythology. I have with us a regular guest of ours, Mr. Brass, from the YouTube channel Brass Wisdom. Check out his channel. Say hi, Mr. Brass, and all that.
Hello there. Hello there, everyone. I'm Mr. Brass. Nice to be on. You got the channel thing?
I'll put it in the low bar after we're done. But currently you have been doing a series on mythology, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. The reason why I got into this is because I've been interested in mythology ever since I was in high school. You know, I originally learned about the Greeks, I learned about the Trojan War, and I just sort of became attached to it, and I wanted to find out, more about mythology and from different cultures and see, what's popular. I did make exceptions because there is mythology in religions like Western religions, like Christianity and Judaism and Islam, but I cut those out deliberately because I wanted to have things that people like in America may not be familiar with.
Okay. All right. And we have with us the analytic alchemist. Say hi.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me on tonight.
You're very welcome. And we also have with us founder of Red Pill Religion, Max Colvey. Say hi, Max.
Hey everybody, how you doing?
All right, and I'm with Mr. Brass on the whole being interested in mythology. When I was a pagan, that was actually one of the things that I focused on was to be able. There is an actual um, study. A, I would call it a study. It wasn't organized, but where it was called bards, where we take stories, mythological stories, and take them apart. Take them apart by their tropes, and then analyze what each of these trope structures means, and how they were put into a story. Because the pagan belief on mythology is that these aren't just stories that say how things happen, but they're also stories of history. If archaeology is to be trusted and believed, the human race is 100,000 years old. So it and we only have 10,000 years of that 100,000 years actually recorded. Before we started writing things down, primarily as a way of historical recollection, we used to use oral stories, and a lot of the times those oral stories were embellished or made so people would be entertained, so people would pay attention to these stories. Um, does anybody have anything to say about that?
Well, sure. I mean, well, for one thing, I will actually make a defense of oral traditions, depending on what the tradition are and who the people are involved keeping it and stuff like that. But there's, real reason to think that a lot of oral traditions may be more reliable over time or more accurate over time than written history. We have this bias to assume that, well, if it's in writing, it's more solid, it's more stable, and that's nonsense because while you can show that a story will change, like if you tell the same story to the same person and then have them repeat it, along a chain of 10, 15, 20 people, eventually the story has changed. But in the great oral traditions, they were poetic. They were written some kind in a verse. They were written in ways that they would be remembered, and it was considered the duty of the elders of the tribe or the priests or whoever they were who were keeping the traditions not to change the oral traditions. You don't change them. This, for example, is why. I mean, this isn't just Christianity, right? But it's one of the reasons you can see that Eastern Orthodox Christianity has changed very little in, since it split from Rome 1,000 years ago, and has changed very little from, 1,600 years ago when they put the Bible together. And that's because they keep the oral traditions alive and they're very stable. You can say the same about Jewish oral tradition, and you can say the same thing about a number of others too. I don't even want to just focus on the Abrahamic faiths, for example. Oral traditions can be powerful, and written, well, you're just trusting the historian, who may have an axe to grind. So I think it's wrong to dismiss oral traditions, as some are going to be stronger than others, obviously. But on the other hand, if you have something written down, just look how people will then start parsing the text and interpreting, like the unchanged written words. You can see this with the Bible. You can see this with the U.S. Constitution. You can see this with various laws. You can see this with various things. You get it written down, and then people start arguing over interpretation. And sometimes they'll come to wildly different conclusions reading the exact same words. Um, so, I mean, oral traditions do matter. I think your ideal is that you have some of both, right? But I mean, I was just watching a podcast on a couple of videos from Joe Rogan, who's talking to various scientists who've concluded that yeah, there was some kind of great flood within the last 10 to 12,000 years, that wiped out quite a bit, and we have reason to think civilizations were lost. I mean, we can't, I can't prove that right now, but we have evidence of it. You know, I was just listening to one guy, talking about, the Great Sphinx and how and he's not a Christian, he's not a religious guy. I mean, he's got no religious basis here. I mean, he's an archaeologist and working with other archaeologists. They look at something like the Great Sphinx, and they see evidence all over the place that thing survived a huge deluge, like sheets of water coming down on it, eroding it very quickly, and how you can see through time it's been altered and changed. Basic over the last few thousand years, there have been multiple attempts to restore it, so the original Sphinx is gone. But there's all kinds of evidence that thing, is from a pre-flood civilization more than 12,000 years old. There's reason to think that's true. I actually find it kind of exciting. We're getting into an era where we're starting to see, we think civilization started roughly 10,000 years ago, but there's reasons to think no, there were civilizations before that, and they just got destroyed. I guess I should bring up the video. I don't have it here. I'm sorry, I'm on my phone, but this archaeologist was showing this footage. Like, the theory was that 12,000 years ago, sea levels were about 300 feet lower than they are now. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, but when he shows it on a map with a computer, what it looks like if you just drop sea levels globally by 300 feet, and oh my God, there's so much more land there. In fact, for example, he shows that what we call the British Isles would not exist if the sea levels were 300 feet lower, because you'd be able to walk over to France, or walk over to Africa. Well, not for Africa, but yeah, you'd be able to walk over to what we call France and stuff like this. And this actually gives credence to the idea that there was a land bridge, between North America and Asia at one point. I don't know what quite point I'm trying to make about this, except that the myth of the flood appears to be a reality, and that we just have various, cultures having interpreted it and remembered it slightly different. But that it happened, we're starting to see modern evidence that it did. So, I mean, I guess that's just, we should take myths more seriously, is what I'm saying.
Right, and Comrade Dimitri, you came in late after I introduced everybody, but you wanted to say something.
I was just going to say that Max mentioned land bridges in between Asia and the Americas. Yeah, we already know there was once one called the Bering Strait land bridge between Alaska and what is now Siberia and Russia, and that's where the Paleo-Indians came through, according to most historians and archaeologists, although there's some new theories that suggest the Paleo-Indians came through the Polynesian route, transoceanic theories, which I think are very possible.
Yeah, considering how the Hawaiian Islands got people onto it, but with the whole land bridge thing, there is, I believe that there is at least a theory that the Strait of Gibraltar, the place that connects the Mediterranean Sea, actually was a land bridge at one time, that connected Spain. It's either Spain or France with Northern Africa. I don't. I know I heard that in school, but I don't have any evidence or anything like that. It's just something that jogged my memory. Mr. Brass, do you have anything to say?
Yes. Another thing that I found interesting when you actually look at the cultures is they all have like a creation myth, where like in Greek mythology they believed, like they had an opposite view of God than what Christians and Jews believe in, and Muslims, because we typically think of, well, God created the universe. Well, they have the opposite idea, that where the universe created the gods. So originally in like Greek mythology, you get chaos, like, which some of them have deified, but some of them they just consider them a prime reality. and basically, at some point, the gods were just made from them. Like, you originally got the heavens and the earth, which had Cronus and the rest of them. And, another interesting cycle that about Greek mythology is the fact that they always had a son conquering the father. For example, they had Cronus stab his father and wound him and overthrow him. They had Zeus beating Cronus, and they also had a big dispute that Prometheus and Zeus had was over information Prometheus had that Zeus would have a son that would try to overthrow him. So there was this overarching theme of having a son overthrow the father.
Well, and later on in the Greek mythology cycle, you had the story of Perseus, which I believe he was the son of Poseidon, who overthrew the gods completely. He went to war with the gods. The whole Golden Fleece epic ended with that.
Well, I will say that even
actually,
then, go ahead.
Well, yeah, actually, with the Tale of the Golden Fleece, because I actually went into that one. Like Jason. Oh wait, no, I may be thinking of the Argonauts, Jason and the Argonauts. Jason and the Argonauts is pretty neat too, although it ends on a very depressing note, where basically he completes his journey and everything, but he ends up being really horrible to this woman that the gods may fall in love with him. He took advantage of it, and he eventually just dumped her, and she got mad and killed their sons. And then basically he tried to get revenge on her, and she ran away. And basically he just spent the rest of his life as a wanderer. He spent the rest of his life as sort of a wanderer, and he would, in his last years, he would go to the discarded, the decaying Argo ship. He would go and sleep in there, and one of the roof tiles just came and crashed on him and killed him.
The thing is, though, and I think this goes back with an issue that I have with mythologists like Joseph Campbell, who had some great insights, but also, he wrote The Power of Myth and The Hero with a Thousand Faces and all that. And he had some very good insights, but he also tended to wring the spiritual and the supernatural elements and reduce them all to, material and just psychological ideas. And that doesn't work. Like, I happen to know, for example, that if you investigate the ancient Stoic religion, which incorporated a lot of the Greek myths, they often had fairly sophisticated views of these things. Like Zeus defeats Cronus, right? Well, Cronus was the master of time. And so within the Stoic religion, they interpreted that as Zeus, the all-powerful father, who they also attributed to being the prime mover. That was an allegory of showing that Zeus was beyond time, could overcome time. Zeus was not even bound by time, let alone space or other considerations. I'm not saying it's exactly like the Christian idea of God, but their idea of Zeus was actually fairly sophisticated. They didn't think he was just this guy, but that he could take human form, not that he had human form all the time, kind of thing. I guess I'm saying there's allegories and metaphors and spiritual messages in some of these ancient myths that we miss. Like you just keyed on the killing of the father trope, which that is a common one, but there's still deeper layers of meaning to a lot of these things. I guess is all I'd say there.
Right. And I agree with that. you have other like mythology, for example. It really ultimately it served its purpose to tell a story of humans before we actually wrote things down. The whole oral, it was an oral story. It was embellished a little bit to be entertaining, because nobody would gather around a campfire around somebody who is telling a boring story. But you would also have the purposes of mythology is to tell some portion of history of that civilization, like the Irish Gaelic mythologies. Um, they went through the history of basically where um the Irish traditions and stories came from the Bard Taliesin and that whole entire story. And you have the Sumerian gods, who their mythology is a little bit different, because some of their mythologies were known as myths, which were basically little tiny things. They're instructions. If you wanted to learn how to build a house, you'd go to the temple and you'd get a me, and there are instructions on how to build a house. And there's a lot of different aspects to that. History Net, you wanted to say something?
Oh yeah. No, actually, I just jumped in.
Okay. Well, welcome. Does anybody else have anything to say?
I was talking about the mythologies also have common themes, like in the beginning, like cultures. These cultures that are worlds apart all have a story of first man and woman. Not really, but first man and woman as they saw it. A tree of life, a forbidden fruit of some sort, forbidden food of some sort, a fallen paradise, a serpentine divine being that stole immortality from man. Also a global flood. Not really the global flood, but how they saw it.
Well, there is ample evidence, though.
There's no actual global flood. There's just a local flood, the Persian Gulf. But that story is no less common memory.
But you also had stories of from South America, from North America, from China, that all portrayed a flood that archaeologists think happened a little bit around the same time. There's an entire civilization on the bed of the Dead Sea.
Yeah, I was just watching. We mentioned this earlier, but I mean, I had just been watching an archaeologist on Joe Rogan's podcast talking about how, yeah, there's substantial evidence that 10, 12,000 years ago, sea levels were 300 feet lower than they are now, and there was a lot more landmass. And there's real evidence for that. And I think the only point I was making about it is that we can't just dismiss mythology. We can't. Even if probably the one I would think that was like an example of mythology too that we like is King Arthur and the Round Table and the Knights of the Round Table, right? Now we know most of those stories are not literally true, but there is reason to think that parts of the Arthurian legends, not all of them obviously, but the parts of them did happen in some way. That some of these people existed. The history doesn't record Arthur as a specific king, although there's my point is that within most mythology, there's almost always some truth in there somewhere. Almost always. And I think that's an important thing to recognize too.
Yeah, but like there's all this off the wall shit, like the Greek mythology, the goddess of love and beauty was born out of the castrated genitals of the sky, or the cum swapping episode between Horus and Set, and the king of the Norse gods being eaten by a wolf during the end times.
The thing is, and I think I made this point earlier, there is also a tendency to primitivize those ancient tales and act like there's no sophistication behind them, but that's like approaching the Bible that way, right? I mean, a lot of those stories likely had spiritual significance and meaning to the people at the time that we're not getting when we just hear the story now, right? That was the point I was making.
Yeah.
About
And,
Arthur. Oh.
yeah. And another thing that's actually pretty interesting is to know how they depicted their gods in cultures. Like, for example, Greek culture was very humanistic with its depiction of gods. You know, all of their gods were basically look like humans. While if you take Egyptian and Mesopotamian gods, they were either animals or animal-human hybrids. So I mean, you know, Edith Hamilton wrote about this in the book on the subject, where you know, where the Greeks were just very much were in love with people, and that was, you know, even if it really reflected their values of hospitality. They were very hospitable people, where they were commanded by their gods to be hospitable and to take in people that asked for it.
Yeah, but their gods were petty and cruel.
Yeah. Oh yeah, but here's the funny thing about this. Here's the funny thing about the Greek gods, though. Even though the Greek gods were to be taken seriously, it was also considered good to laugh at the tales of Zeus's adulterous ways and stuff.
Yeah. Can I say something about King Arthur real quick?
Yes.
They say that King Arthur may have been based on a real life Roman commander who was stationed in what is now Britain, or Britannia as it was called, Roman province, and his name was Lucius Artorius Costus, who was a 3rd century or 2nd or 3rd century Roman commander in Britannia. So I just thought that was really interesting.
You mean
historians believe that he's the what?
You mean Ambrosius? He lived in the 5th century.
Ambrosius?
Yeah, Ambrosius. I think that's
Ambrosius. This Roman commander is named Ambrosius Castus. And,
yeah, I remember.
Well, there's a lot of debate
on him,
about.
Yeah, based on him, Alfred the Great, and Charlemagne.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of debate on, you know, how old the actual story of King Arthur is, because there's a story that is similar. I would guess that the Gaelic translation of the main character could have been Arthur, but the whole idea of Knights of the Round Table and stuff like that there was a story similar to that before the Roman occupation of Britain.
Really?
Yes. It's I would have to go through from memory on it, because I don't have it written down anywhere. But it was one of the stories that I went through.
I remember the Knights of the Round Table being based on Charlemagne's paladins.
Yes, that is one theory. There's a lot of different theories about King Arthur. Whether or not it was all a story, you know, to told post Roman Empire, or if it happened before the Roman Empire, or if it happened during the Roman occupation. There's still a lot of questions about that. And there are scholars that are actually trying to dig deeper into that.
It was it's kind of like Sargon of Akkad. His legend grew over time.
Yes.
It's also like trying to think of what's his name. It's Enkidu. I mean, it's
Gilgamesh and
like
Enkidu.
Gilgamesh. Yeah, they say Gilgamesh might have been a real king, but all the stories, he was a real king, but the legends grew over time.
Gilgamesh was likely Nimrod.
Yeah, it could be.
Well,
And
Nimrod could have been a king that predated Gilgamesh.
That's
as
what
well.
Nimrod means, the rebel. And Gilgamesh's story is the first ever God is dead story.
yeah, and
Oh, really?
and a lot of people don't really realize about how much of our stories actually do date back. Like our themes for our stories really do date back to, let's say,
Well, because
mythology. We all know Beauty and the
there,
Beast, and
yeah, there's only so many tropes.
you can find, in Greek mythology, you can find the story of Cupid and Psyche, which is basically, when you extract the themes, is basically the same thing as Beauty and the Beast.
Well,
And
did you know?
there's a Cinderella story going all the way back to ancient Egypt.
Yeah, and the story of Aladdin was actually originally Chinese.
Yeah, Chinese.
Picked up
Yeah,
by Indians, and then when they picked it up and passed it on to Western Europe.
I
And
know. It's very good.
Come to think of it, Mulan was also a historical figure. But we don't know that Mulan.
Oh, Milan, yeah.
We don't know really if she existed or not. I mean, there's debate on that.
Yeah.
Some think that she was just a story that they told to we don't know yet. The details is very sketchy.
Either way, she's considered to be the Joan of Arc of the East. So,
Well, I mean, what's even funny about that is Joan of Arc gets really blown out of the water too. Is like she wasn't really a military person either, because really she was more like the cheerleader for the French.
basically, yeah, and she was actually kind of she was feminine at one point, and then she was kind of forced to presume a more guyish personality due to the fact she wanted to prevent herself from being raped by many of the troops on the battlefield.
Well, that's part of it. She also didn't want to actually dress like a woman.
The legend of the Maid of Lorraine was floating around at that time, and she fit the profile. You know, like the prophet Merlin predicted 1,000 years beforehand.
Yeah, definitely.
And if I also wanted to say something else is like, no, to go off of Greek and Roman mythology, we can go into Norse mythology, like with Odin and the rest. What's actually interesting is, when you actually go into if you actually go into the tale of Odin and stuff like that, you can find that the values that the Norse people had were the complete opposite that the Greeks had. Like,
because many
for example, oh, you go. What were you going to say, Robert?
I was just gonna say, like, that's because the Vikings were a Northern European people, along with the Slavs and Balts and Celtic people. So,
but there is speculation that certain Norse gods were worshipped in India as Hindu gods, and then the Indo-Europeans, when they migrated, created their own mythology.
Well, because the ancient Greeks had more of they had more contact with India, that Eurasian trade zone, than the Norse Vikings, or Proto-Vikings, I should say, at this time.
Yes, come to think of it, Sigurd was also a real person, and Brunhilde.
Yeah. Here's what you gotta know about the Norse people wouldn't have considered the Greek gods to be heroic, because to the Norse people, what was considered heroic was not just fighting in battle, but it was also fighting against injustice even when you know you were losing.
Yeah, like in...
to the Norse people, the Greek gods, since they were all powerful pretty much, and they were immortal, there was no stakes at it. All of the Norse gods were mortal. They were powerful beings, but they were mortal, and they were going to eventually die. They're going to eventually die.
Well, they were technically mortal. What gave them their immortality was eating the golden apple.
Well, the Greek gods were mortal also.
Somewhat, not as much as the other gods. There's the whole story of Artemis. Was it Artemis? It's the archer. the archer, the goddess of the hunt and of
Yeah.
war. She according to the story, she had a bow and arrow, and that was the only thing that could kill the gods of Mount Olympus. It was
The Emperor's bow.
yeah. With the differences between Norse mythology, between the Greek and Norse mythology, you had the idea of the world tree, and
Yep.
the world
The many trees of life.
right, but the roots of the world tree, the races that inhabit the roots of the world tree are like the dwarves and gnomes and stuff, and then up on top of the tree, that's where the elves are, which elves and in Norse mythology are winged creatures. And
World Tree also.
the Valkyries. They would carry the bravest Viking warriors up to Valhalla, where they enjoyed the afterlife forever, fighting and feasting forever, where their wounds
Ever do.
where their wounds miraculously healed night after night.
Well, actually, like with the whole thing with the Norse gods was that, you know, if you died and you got to go to Valhalla, basically all you were doing is you were staying there temporarily until Ragnarok.
It's interesting about Ragnarok is that's one of the few pagan stories that actually talk about in end times about reality as we know it ending. There's a few things in Eastern mythology, but for the most part, other than that's the whole idea of end times. It seems to be monotheistic, and it's weird because the Norse mythology well before the before Christianity had this entire this is how the world began. This is how the world is going to end. And when the world ends, the things will be switched. Thor will become the Allfather. Hell will come up from the underworld, and instead of her being, controlling of the underworld, she'd be controlling an aspect of the living. Hell is the goddess of the dead. And it's everything. Just Loki goes from a trickster god to, I forget what he is. I think he's sent to be the god of the underworld. I forget Ragnarok.
Where'd you get the idea that the gods were all wiped out in Greek mythology?
Well, the idea that the whole Perseus
God of
epic,
War.
No, it wasn't Perseus. He didn't. He just slew Medusa.
Well, he did more than slew Medusa. That wasn't the end of the story. He went to fight the Gorgon for some reason, and then that branched off of another quest. The story of Perseus actually goes on for like 4 or 5 stories, with the ending of him saying that the gods are petty and cruel.
Well, yeah.
And he actually went to war against them.
I think that carried off to Hercules, didn't it?
Hercules and Perseus were supposedly friends.
Well, they were all related if you think about it.
Great grandfather.
Yeah, and I was also going in, like in my video, like part 8 of my series. What I did is I went into bonus myths, legends, and folktales, and I actually got into the North American Indians. The Choctaws. I can't pronounce it, but
Fun fact.
Basically,
go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, basically with the Choctaw Indians, they believed that there was a mountain that had a passage from the top of the caverns to under the earth, and these caverns arose the Choctaws along with the ants. The Choctaws killed the ants' mother and called on their god Abba to close the exit of the mountain, which locked the remaining people in there, and they later transformed into ants.
Oh yeah, fun fact.
Yeah, what?
You know the Vikings landed in North America 5 centuries before Columbus?
Well, yeah.
Temporarily.
Although their findings were pretty much nothing because they pretty much stayed there for they did really nothing with the land and they went back.
Yeah, because they got their asses kicked. They didn't have guns or anything like the. Yeah.
Wasn't that in Newfoundland?
Yeah.
Newfoundland or something like that. It's some part of Canada. It wasn't even a big portion. There's from what I could see, there was an iron mining, not an iron mining, but a place for iron smelting that they found, and they found a couple structures and a couple satellite structures.
Another fun fact, you know that all these cultures having common motifs, like they were all aware of giants also, and guess what tales certain Native American tribes had about giants? These semi-divine offspring that God inspired them to kill off the Great Spirit, drive out from their land.
You know who else has stories about giants?
Nephilim. The Nephilim.
Well, that's not
people in New York.
That's not all of giants.
Right, I'm saying they're in every culture.
Yeah, they're in every culture, but I wouldn't call them Nephilim. For there does seem to be evidence and through oral history that there was a race of gigantic humanoids on Earth. And there could be multiple reasons why we haven't found any evidence of that. We could have found evidence of that
because they were partially divine. Their bodies will leave no physical trace.
Oh yeah, but I mean, there's all these accounts though. There's a grain of truth in every mythology because deep down the whole purpose of mythology was to tell the story, tell the history of the human, that area where humans were.
Even the gods were real in a sense. They just weren't gods.
Yeah.
They were lesser divine beings that God allotted territory to on Earth. Then they rebelled.
Analytic alchemist wants to say something.
Yeah. We actually have quite a bit of evidence for giants. We have a lot of archaeological digs and newspaper articles from the late 1800s from the mid 1800s into the early-ish 1900s that affirmed these digs, and they were published by the Smithsonian Institute itself, actually. You can't find these anymore, though, oddly enough. And I'm going to be doing a few videos on the Smithsonian really soon on my channel because I do think they are involved in a conspiracy to cover up evidence of giants.
Be careful to jump to that conclusion, though.
Well, I mean, the person who not created but who discovered the Galapagos Islands, the original his original report of the scouting was that there was a civilization there, and that the human-looking beings that were there, they were tall, and they had like this weird thing going on with their earlobes and stuff. And then I think it was 20 years after that report, when people came to the Galapagos Islands, they saw nothing but, or no, it was the Easter Islands. I'm sorry, not the Galapagos Islands, but the Easter Islands, the one with the island with all those big heads that we don't actually have any real explanation for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been talking to an archaeologist from my state named Jim Vieira about giants, and he actually has a book out that I would recommend people read. Would you mind if I plug that here?
Go right ahead.
Yes.
Okay. Let me pull it up. You guys can talk about anything while I find this.
Well, yeah.
Well, there's a lot of weird things with giants, specifically, because the whole thing about giants, giant mythology, and the different evidence that of giants is really something that the ancient astronaut theorists are big on. And let's pull up this. All right, here we
I don't
go.
know if you can screen share that or not.
By Richard J. Dewars, The Ancient Giants Who Ruled America.
His book's called Giants on Record, America's Hidden History, and the author is Jim Vieira, and I think it's co-authored with Hugh Newman, who is, I believe, another archaeologist.
Here it is. Hold on, let me screen share this. All right. Giants on Record. 2015, Jim Vieira, author, and Hugh Newman, author. And then, we have other books on this, the Missing Skeletons of the Giants, which it could be the American giants would be the Sasquatches, because they're reported to be 7 feet, 8 feet tall. That's another mythological creature.
They were described as being red and hairy.
Right, and that's one of the few mythological creatures that are actually confined to North America. They seem to be the Native Americans have the story of the Sasquatches in the Skunk Ape. From the Northwest all the way down to Florida, the Seminole Indians in Florida have stories about a Sasquatch type of creature. And Sasquatches are giant and hairy. I think 7 to 8 feet tall is a median of.
Yeah, in a lot of the newspaper articles that I've read from over 100 years ago, the average size seems to be anywhere from 9 to 18 feet, actually.
Okay, that makes more sense. But I'm just going off of the 20th century Bigfoot sightings, and let's
not get into that.
Well, I mean it's there are illegitimate Bigfoot sightings, but there are also fairly credible sightings in places like in Maine and in Oregon in the 20th century of people who were camping in these national forests, and they experienced
if there were giants still alive, they wouldn't be hiding from us.
I mean, maybe not.
Well, stories from various Native American tribes say that they were
conquering. They'd be conquering
either that or they would be
in the past.
Well, either that or they'd be in the NBA.
HistoryNet. That's not necessarily the case. A lot of stories from various Native tribes say that they were hiding from them because they were at war with the humans.
But they wouldn't need to fear humans. They overpowered humans. That's why the Israelites were scared shitless even when they had God on their side.
Well, not necessarily. If you look up the story of the Lovelock Cave out in Nevada, the giants fled from them, and actually the story goes that the native peoples there actually cornered them in a cave and set fire to the cave and burnt them all alive.
Because they had God on their side.
Yeah, could be.
The Great Spirit.
I mean, and in some of the Native American stories, yes, there does seem to be a war, but there's other tribes that actually, according to their stories, lived with these creatures. You know, like the Seminole Indians, for example. Their stories about the skunk ape or the southern Sasquatch is is one of symbiotic, a symbiotic relationship, because they would go, they would actually trade with these creatures in some sense. You also had the Hopi tribes, which, the cave paintings and stuff like that. That's a weird thing that ancient astronaut theorists like to go on, because the Hopi Indians, they had like all sorts of different paintings in their caves, and one of them was of giant humans trading with them and being peaceful with them. If
ancient alien theory's been debunked to the moon and back, pun intended.
Not necessarily. I mean, you have a lot of things that people claim have been debunked that have not actually been debunked. Like there are people who claim that evolution debunks certain things, but evolution itself, there's holes within evolution. It's not really an observable thing, and it's not something that can be tested. It's something that it will have to be observed in thousands of years. It's observable, kind of, but that's dependent on what kind of record we have, and it wasn't until very recently that we started actually measuring these things. So we don't know how much has changed in the 100,000 years since humans popped up on this planet. And we do have archaeological evidence that has 100,000-year-old skeleton, Homo sapien skeleton. It predates the mitochondrial Eve. It's a fairly recent discovery.
Well, not that recent. The mitochondrial Eve is the ancestor of all humans living today. Not humans in general.
But supposedly.
No, she lived 200,000 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah, another story I'd like to get into is like a folk tale. It's a common one about John Henry. This was, an American folk tale. This is basically about a black man who lived in Black River Country.
Yeah.
We know about these stories they go all the way back to the 1870s. And he was a guy that he was known for his work ethic, and he would defeat a steam drill with sledgehammer,
like
drilling into a mountain.
Like a Black Paul Bunyan.
Pretty much, except he wasn't a giant.
Yeah.
Well, the whole entire tall tale of both Paul Bunyan and John Henry were stories that were against automation. Because John Henry, the whole idea of John Henry is he was trying to, lay down track faster than a machine. Paul Bunyan was trying to, cut down trees faster than a machine. Both of them couldn't do it.
And there's different times where people think Robin Hood lived, but he's a mythical character, I know, but there could have been a thief that inspired him, steal from the rich, give to the poor, but we don't have a definitive characteristic of him.
Right. We do have a guy like that. We got trying to think of his name. God. Never mind. I can't remember him.
There was a nobleman named Sir Robin of Locksley, whose father was.
Was this during around the time of the Third Crusade?
Yeah,
That's the time.
it was around the Third Crusade. Yes.
Yeah.
And whether or not the entire folklore of Sherwood Forest and all that happened, it could have happened, but it's I think it was more of a story against the corruption of
shrouded in legend, like King Arthur.
Yeah, it was shrouded in legend, and it provided a tale to tell kids and adults about about a certain aspect of when it is okay to steal, type of thing. Because it at the time the British government was fairly corrupt. There was corrupt elements of the British government during that time. It is very well documented. So I would say it's plausible.
What do you make of Romulus? Do you think he exists?
The whole story of Romulus,
I know the sucking on the wolf's teeth to survive, that was bullshit, but I think there was a first king.
Well, how do you know? You weren't there.
I mean, dog milk can actually nourish a newborn baby.
Someone hasn't watched Princess Mononoke.
You would know. You would know. I mean, wait. How would you know that? Are you been up to anything, man?
Well, no. It's there's. It's one of the few mammals that if you really need to, because cow's milk really isn't good for a baby. It's not really good until like you're past your toddler ages.
We're not talking about Jungle Book here, man.
Well, no. I mean the human body cannot actually the human body when you're a baby cannot actually process cow's milk. That's why they tell you when you have a kid, do not give them cow's milk until the age of 3. But
what women's boobs were made for.
There's some mammals that have that their lactation does seem to have a little bit more nourishing aspects, and the canine. There's a study like done in the 70s about this. Which was going on with Dances with Wolves, because the whole there is a folklore trope of a human that is raised by animals, essentially. It happens enough throughout multiple different cultures that I would think that at least one or two of those.
No. Dances with Wolves. That was a Civil War cavalryman that was fascinated, wanted to see the frontier before it was industrialized, and he lived among the Sioux tribe.
Oh, that's right. I forget. I forgot. I'm sorry. I was thinking of the Jungle Book.
How did you get those mixed up?
I don't know. Jack London and
Well, it's all the wolf's milk that he's been sucking.
Yeah.
He's not able to tell the difference between Jungle Book and Tarzan.
Well, Tarzan was
Yeah.
in Africa.
I also got into Hindu mythology, where about the story of Raja or whatever. He was basically a man, who just a regular guy who basically took the throne of a storm god named Indra. And basically Brahma had just said, like, there was this war going on between the gods and the demons, and basically Brahma said whoever is on Raja's side will win. So both the gods and the demons bribed him, but he ultimately chose the gods, so the gods won.
That's interesting, because in
something interesting about Hindu. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, basically what happened is that Raja, would be made king afterwards, and he would overthrow Indra, the storm god, and he'd make Indra the deputy of heaven. And here's the thing: as after Raja had died, Indra refused to acknowledge Raju's sons to the right to the throne and took back the throne for himself.
Indra may have originally been Thor. No, Thor may have been original.
Well, I do know that in the old Indus Valley civilization, Indra was like the top god until the Aryan invasion. I'm getting my centuries mixed up here, but and then when the Aryan invasions came along, Indra was more relegated to like a secondary god.
Actually, we don't know anything about the Indus Valley religion.
Yeah, no, we're talking about the Aryan invasion, where the Aryans came from South India, correct?
It came from
what is now actually
came from the mountains.
Well, I mean, there's stories in Indian folklore where where there is a group of people that called themselves Aryan that originated from some part of southern India. It is possible that they originated from Antarctica, but that's an interesting continent, because there's been so many discoveries on that continent, and it's all been not shared with the public.
But anyway, back to the mythology. We don't know anything about the Indus religion, but we
know some stuff.
I mean, we don't really know a lot about the Indica Valley.
We know Krishna lived during that time, but other than that, we don't know very much about the gods because their formal scriptures weren't written until
and this is all oral what I'm talking about too. So,
well, with the Inca Valley civilization, the interesting thing about that is that they didn't actually find any implements of war within that area, but the civilization disappeared. It was a civilization that they found Roman coins in, Roman and Greek coins. So the Romans and the Greeks did do trade, and it's possible that the Chinese and other Asians did trade with them as well. It's just that it's one of the many civilizations that were a peaceful civilization.
China didn't really rise. Go ahead.
Oh, the Romans didn't really rise at this time either, but I think it was like the earliest. It's a mythical dynasty. The earliest Chinese dynasty at the time of the Indus Valley civilization would have been the mythical Xia dynasty.
Yeah.
But yeah, that had trade.
There could have been a dynasty like that, but they were more chieftains, not kings, until around the time of David. That's when China began to be relevant.
I mean, the history, I would say is relevant. Even before that, it would be an interesting history if Mao Zedong didn't destroy the history that he didn't agree with.
Oh yeah, if he didn't destroy all of Buddhist temples and ancient Chinese religious sites, we could have had a whole bunch more knowledge right now.
Well, with the interesting thing about the Buddhist based mythologies, other than the dragon conundrum, all the dragons in the East are peaceful, and they're purveyors of wisdom, where the dragons of the West are all beasts that will kill us all, and murderous beast type of thing.
Go ahead.
It's one of the weird things. But the Asian mythologies are very interesting.
That's another common motif: the dragons.
Yeah.
All over the world.
And it is possible. I think it is possible that dragons did exist.
The Nazis had a huge interest in Tibet, areas like Tibet and Nepal, because they believed it was what they thought was the Aryan, race that had invaded India. As we know, the original Aryans, who were not Nazis, they were not proto-Nazis,
white.
They believed that they could. What?
Or white.
Yeah. They believed that they could excavate these areas in what is now Tibet and Nepal, and bring back, loot the artifacts. But unfortunately for them, the war broke out in Europe before they could actually do any serious excavating Hitler sent a group to Tibet, a German excavation team to Tibet, and one of the leaders was named Heinrich Harrier, and he eventually, when the war broke out in Europe, he got captured and sent to a POW camp in India, and then escaped from that, went to Tibet, and he stayed there until the communist invasion, and that's where he had to flee Tibet again.
Wasn't that there's a story that there's a movie that Brad Pitt was in.
Yeah, it's called 7 Years in Tibet. That was the same name of his book too, 7 Years in Tibet.
I mean, well, I mean, there's a lot of interesting things about mythology. It's mythology was primarily like I've said before. I'm going to say it again. Is primarily a way that early humans used to tell not just how things were, but history as well. Like there various mythologies like to say that there were civilizations prior to the Greek civilizations. Prior, the Egyptian mythologies said there is civilizations prior to the Egyptian mythology. Egypt. There's there's mythologies within Egyptian mythology that said all of northern Africa was a lush and green place, and not the desert it is that we see it is today. It was much more green during the Bronze Ages than it is today, as well. That's seen from records when we started actually writing. When the Bronze Age was about the time when written history started to become the thing that our species did. But yeah, to address our good friend.
And there's also the similarities of gods in other cultures that the Greeks and Egyptians have identified certain gods as each other's and Canaanite gods, and yeah, like Ra and Utu or Shamash were the same god, and probably it would probably stand to reason that if Ra was the overlord of the so-called gods, that he was also revered in South America as Inti.
I mean, it is possible. It is also possible that that all these different gods are just different perspectives on the same god. To address Charlie Reed that dragons existed. Yes, I think dragons did exist. I think that you have the Leviathan story from Jewish mythology, which is a river dragon. You have also within Jewish mythology,
the personification of watery chaos.
Yeah,
that we see commonly also.
Also within Jewish mythology pre-Moses, and even post-Moses, there was the stories of God was fighting against these dragon-like creatures before he created existence. There's the angels, the pantheon of angels existed prior to humans being created. That they were created for primarily for war, but they were also messengers between the created beings. But it just seems like the angels, their main purpose was war. And why would you have war if there wasn't some kind of threat? And you also have the dragons of up in the Norse mythologies. You have the dragons in, I think there's the Wotan. And
same thing. Also in China, also in the Americas.
Yeah, and whether or not they actually breathe fire, that's I mean, that could be possible. I mean, you could have something like alcohol coming out of a gland, but it's more or bioluminescent fluorescence of some kind that is exuded could do something like fire does. But as far as
It could be like how what the Komodo dragon does, where it spits at you and it feels like you've been hit by fire.
right.
Don't be going Ken Ham there.
No, I mean there's a lot of possibilities though, as far as we can't discount everything. We can't discount everything just because we don't have an example in the modern day of it. Because humans can breathe fire. You take some really high proof alcohol, spit it out in front of a flame, you're breathing fire. I would say that if dragons did breathe fire, something, it would be something like that. There'd be some kind, that is if they actually breathe fire. But that was only in Western Europe. The mythological dragons of South America, of the Middle East, well, not the Middle East, but the Eastern areas, the Asian areas, didn't breathe fire.
Quetzalcoatl was one of them.
Yeah. I mean, it's to say that it wasn't possible though. There's I think is kind of a stretch. To say that it was possible is kind of a stretch as well, because we truly don't know if an animal like that existed. If it did exist, more than likely humans hunted it out of existence, much like we did to every other carnivorous predator on this planet, primarily, with the exception of Africa. But Africa is basically one huge continent, nature preserve. The entire continent is nature preserve, because humans, have been hunting predators for our own protection to extinction in some cases.
Anyway, Brass, what were you saying? I keep interrupting.
Yeah, and I just think this whole mythology series is pretty good.
This is a fascinating talk, Revan. Sorry.
Yeah, I liked doing the research for it. I read 2 books on the subject. I read one by Edith Hamilton, and I read another one by Mercatante. Mercatante went more in depth with the folklore and mythologies in there than Edith Hamilton did. Edith Hamilton more or less focused on the Greek and Roman gods, while, at the very end going into the Norse gods. But the Encyclopedia of Mythology by Mercatante is pretty top-notch scholarly stuff.
You know what? We don't have
very interesting learning.
We don't have much sources on the Norse mythology. They go earlier than the 10th century AD or the.
Most of those
that's really because Christians wiped out pretty much all the Norse people.
That too.
When in doubt, blame the Christians.
When in doubt.
Well, no, there's there is legit reason though to get angry at Christians with that, because that is true. They did do that.
Yeah.
It's true. It's true also in the case of the Baltic mythology too. Much of the Baltic mythology, like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, doesn't exist anymore because the crusading Catholic order known as the Teutonic Knights and the Livonian Sword Brothers just wiped out all the old Baltic paganism.
Yeah.
I mean, with that though, there's the Catholics, didn't do it just because they were Christian though. The barbarian tribes of Western Europe were a threat to people.
That's true.
But can you really blame them? They've been fighting Romans for centuries.
I was gonna say, that's true, because you look at before too. You had the the constant trials and tribulations of the migration period when you had groups like the Vikings and the Arab Muslims pillaging both southern and northern Europe. So, by the time the High Middle Ages came around, hold on. So by the time the High Middle Ages came around in the 11th century, Western Christendom was ready to strike back. So, I'm done.
Well, with that, you had that stuff going on in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, we had the Eastern Europeans were more fighting with the Muslims essentially in the Middle East. What?
And the Slavs. Don't forget the Slavic people too. They kept pillaging the Byzantine Empire.
And here's what's funny. When the Crusades were happening and Genghis Khan and stuff got caught up in the middle of those battles. Guess who was the only people to have religious tolerance?
The Mongols.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Mongols were the only people that had the religious tolerance during the time.
Yeah, because they sacked everyone.
Yeah, they believed all the religions they came in contact with had a common source, and they were right. But
and when they were pillaging Russia, the only thing they left intact were the churches there.
And the funny thing is that anti-theists get all in a hissy about the Crusades, even though Genghis Khan's rampage was 4 times worse.
Oh yeah, yeah. There's some new historical theories that actually.
Well, wait. Just so you get it, you actually said the name wrong. It's not actually Genghis Khan. It's Chinggis Khan.
Or Temujin, whatever.
Well, yeah. Well, Chinggis Khan is actually a title. It's not really a name.
I know. That's why I said Temujin.
It's sort of like, yeah, it's like, it's sort of how we call Donald Trump the President of the United States.
Yeah.
It's like the same thing. It's just a title. It's not referring to any specific. The name in of itself doesn't refer to anyone specific. Temujin is typically who we mean by Genghis Khan or Chinggis Khan for better.
I don't know about that, but I was about to say that there's new historical theories that suggest that the reason why Russia, the Middle East, and China advances west because they're still suffering Mongol destruction that happened in their countries in the 13th century. I mean,
that's also funny that the Mongol Empire was even bigger than the Roman Empire, and they were just nomads as compared to a professional militaristic society like Rome.
Well, that's part of the reason why they were able to expand, because they were so decentralized. This idea of the emperor and state authority and whatnot. Whereas the Mongols, they just ruled over pretty dense, or not densely, pretty spacey land.
Although the Romans did fight people that were Mongol-like, or they have some kind of ancestral connections. Yeah. Attila brought the Roman Empire to its knees, and then the Visigoths finished them off later.
Well, you had a bunch of different things happening with the Mongols at the time. Tingri is actually an interesting.
Their version of God.
Well, it's their version of religion. Tingri is Tingriism, in particular is a fairly what's the word? It's very complex. Well, it's a fairly complex thing. And it's weird. I mean, it's weird as far as how Western pagan religions were structured, and how other East, like Buddhism and the different forms of spiritualism in China at that time. It was kind of based on war, but not really.
A good thing that's also nice to know about it is that what we know about progress is usually like the idea of moral progress is actually a Christian invention because it's not really found in Eastern or like pagan mythology. Because a lot in Indian mythology, because with a lot of Indians, they didn't see they believed in the eternal now, where they believed, they didn't believe in a past or future. They believed just in the now. And with Eastern religions, they believe that it's eternal and we're just going through a cycle.
And depending on the Hindu you talk to, that all the Hindu gods are just aspects of the one god, Brahman.
Yeah. And so Christianity was the only one that had linear time frame, and it was directly for religious reasons because basically it was seen as before Christ was a time of sin and after Christ was a time of redemption. So they had reasons to judge moral progress on like a linear level, while the Eastern and the Indians and the pagans didn't have that model because they didn't have that redemption model in it.
Yeah, BC were some crazy times.
Well, the whole idea of redemption is fairly new as far as humans are concerned. It's just like the idea that slavery is bad is something that pretty much most of humanity has accepted, and that was only 100 years ago, and it well, a little bit more than 100 years now, but 1860s was around when this was actually accepted by a majority of humans. There is still slavery that is happening today. We just we just have it in the prisons. We outsource the slavery to the white man, to the government in the prisons. That's what the 14th Amendment has a loophole with that. It's like slavery is okay as long as it's the prison system. Well, with indentured servitude was called it was okay to be a part of, but that was changed in I think in mid 20th century. Where they said no, slavery is never okay. The only actual places in the world that slavery is being practiced is in Saudi Arabia and another country.
China.
Well, partially, but it's a country that has been funding Al Jazeera. I forget the name of it.
England.
No, the English basically ended slavery by colonizing Africa and deposing the African kings that sold their political enemies and rival tribes into slavery.
How about North Korea?
Yeah. I wonder if Eric is Analytic Alchemist still here?
Yeah.
Yeah. You haven't got a chance to say anything. You say you got anything to say about the whole mythology stuff?
I think not, because I'm not too versed in a lot of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's I think what it was very fascinating when I was going through this research is just the ideas like they shared similarities in a lot of ways where they always tried to like stories of love, like the quick love, like love at first sight.
Yeah.
That was a big thing back then, which is actually pretty funny
a lot
because
easier than today, where you have to work to get to know a woman.
Well, yeah. I mean, here's what's funny about people don't tend to think about is like back then, romantic love was sort of like an ideal, but it wasn't like something that was really justified enough to marry for someone.
I mean, it's not like they had like they had many restaurants back then you could go on a date with, and or
Well,
movie.
yeah, and here's like pretty much for most of our time frame, for most of our history, love was not really the essential thing to marriage. It was more or less all marriages were arranged. And, you know, people like to say that's sexist against women. I said, you don't know the guy. Maybe the guy doesn't want to get married to the woman. You don't know him. They're like, neither one had the choice.
Well, marriage was primarily a way of uniting families.
And doing politics.
And doing politics, yes. Where the peasants, it was a little bit different, but with the peasants there was still arranged marriages and for different reasons.
Even the gods got married.
Well, yeah, but it's as far as humans went in the Bronze Ages up until fairly recently, up until like the 1800s, so about the 19th century. It was just accepted as the idea of marrying for love really didn't come about until I would say around the Romantic period, but I'm not entirely sure on that.
It came about due to the Industrial Revolution.
The concept of childhood came around after that time.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, I mean, childhood, as we know, is a social construct. It's completely dependent on the society you're living in. What constitutes childhood.
I was gonna say, in the Jewish tradition, once you hit 13, you're considered to be a man. That's what the whole bar mitzvah thing is about.
Yeah.
Well, that's there's actual reasons for that, though. Humans didn't always live until their 60s on average. They 30s was considered elderly in the Bronze Ages. And you were an elder if you actually survived until you're 30, and that was a lot harder than it is today. A lot more people can die of old age than during a time when civilization as we know it was barely created. Not saying that civilization.
Then there's a modern mythology, like the worst of which is what we call the Christ myth theory.
That's not more of a myth. That's more of a conspiracy theory.
It's the myth that Jesus it's the myth that Jesus never walked the earth, and the conspiracy that the big bad Christian scholars are pulling the strings and influencing the decisions of the atheist scholars, agnostic scholars, Jewish scholars.
Well,
pagan scholars.
That's not necessarily true, but okay. With that whole thing, that whole conspiracy theory, it's kind of Arianism 2.0. Arian Christianity was basically they didn't believe Jesus was in a corporeal body. The Arian Christianity, which is not Aryan but Arian, it is very important to notice that distinction there. It wasn't based on whiteness or anything like that. It was based primarily that Jesus did not have a physical body, and he materialized so people can see them, but when he was crucified, he never actually died because he didn't exist in a corporeal body.
The mythology of the cosmic sperm bank.
Yeah, essentially. It was the Arian heresy, which it was a heresy. It was decided as a heresy after debate. There a lot of the things that were decided. A lot of the early Christian, a lot of the patristic writings, which is very important to understanding Christianity. They were all debates. It was they were either debating the Arians or they're debating the Gnostic Christians, you know. But a lot of the big long writings that we actually study as Christians were debates with these people, and you can actually, you know, with these different points of view in the early times. Like this whole idea that Jesus never existed was addressed in the, you know, 2nd or 3rd century.
No, that hasn't come up until the 18th century.
Well, no, Arian Christianity existed, you know, in the 2nd and 3rd.
They just saw him as a
centuries.
purely celestial being, but they didn't argue that it never existed.
Well, they argued he didn't exist in a body, in a corporeal form, which isn't the same. But it's that's why I'm saying it's like the resurgence of that idea, basically. But it's now 11:09.
Yeah.
We started.
There's a new guy. Go ahead.
We started about 9:30ish. It's 11:09, and we gotta do things. I gotta go do things. So, anybody have any final thoughts on mythology?
Yeah. Like I said, this was a great. I'm glad to have been able to do the Mythos series. You know, it'd be good. I have a bunch of other projects in store for later on, and I hope when I eventually edit all this out and, you know, put it all together later on, you know, it'll all be just a very good thing. You know, as always, this is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise.
All right, Analytic Alchemist, do you have anything to say?
Sure. Giants existed, and the Smithsonian sucks.
Okay. HistoryNet, do you have anything?
Not really. Other than there's mythology has bits and pieces of truth to it, but it's mostly fragmented and distorted. But there's the source materials are no less true in essence.
All right. Comrade Dimitri, do you have anything you want?
I just wanted to add this was an excellent conversation we had about movies, so hope to do it again.
All right. I want to apologize to Misanthropic Zombie. I apologize. We're cutting we're not cutting it short, but I apologize that I didn't actually invite you. Thank you for telling us our public Discord chat link is not working. I be sure to. I mean, this was a good conversation. Hopefully it got some people to think. You know, and be sure to do the thing that you normally do on YouTube, as far as the whole drill about, you know, liking and subscribing and all that other jazz. Tell your friends and enemies about us, and God bless everybody.